So we're going to start out our LAS 150 course by learning a little bit about Latin American Studies terms, specifically the terms that are used to describe people of Latin America and their descendants. These are terms like Latino, Latin American, Hispanic, that I'm sure you're familiar with because we use them all the time in everyday life. However, sometimes in everyday life they're used interchangeably or in a different way than how they're used within the field of Latin American Studies. So it's important to learn about how they are used within this field so that you don't confuse people. It's also good to know about how terms can be used both as labels and identities so that you can avoid unintentionally offending someone. So at this point you see all of these terms, labels, identities. You see Chicano, Latino, Hispanic, words that you're familiar with, and you're probably thinking to yourself, so what's the difference? Well, within the field of Latin American Studies, the terms that are used to describe Latin Americans and their descendants are generally used differently depending on two things. Number one, geographic context, and number two, whether they're being used as a label or an identity. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth in a moment. So as I mentioned, the terms Latin American and Hispanic are used differently in a global context as opposed to in the U.S. In the context of Latin America, or in a general global context, we use Hispanic to refer to Spanish-speaking countries, whereas Latin America includes all of South America. So Shakira, for example, is both Hispanic and Latin American because she speaks Spanish. She's from Colombia. She's from a country that was colonized by Spain, thus Hispanic, and she also is part of Latin America. Colombia is part of Latin America. Now, the supermodel on the other side, Gisele Bündchen, however, is not Hispanic. She's from Brazil, and Brazil was not colonized by Spain. It was colonized by Portugal, so they speak Portuguese. She is, however, still Latin American. Now, on the other hand, within the U.S. context, Latin Americans are people who are born outside of the U.S., and Latinos are their descendants. So the word Latino is generally used within the U.S. context, not really outside of the U.S. context. For example, Jennifer Lopez was born in the United States, in the Bronx, right? Jenny from the Bronx. She is Latina. She's not Latin American. Now, on the other hand, Desi Arnaz from I Love Lucy was not born in the States. He was born and grew up in Cuba, so he is Latin American. If, however, Desi Arnaz and his wife had a child, which they did, that child would be Latino or Latina, not Latin American, because that child would be born in the U.S. to parents from Latin America, or at least one parent from Latin America. In the context of the U.S., we use the words Latino and Hispanic to refer to the same people, but each of these terms is emphasizing different things. Hispanic emphasizes being colonized by Spain, speaking the Spanish language, and having something in common with Spain culturally. The word Latino, more and more Hispanics in the U.S. or Latinos are preferring the word Latino because they think that it includes and doesn't exclude their other parts of their heritage, like Portuguese, Indigenous, African. So you can see all of these ladies could be called either Latino or Hispanic. But more and more they probably are preferring to be called Latino or Latina, what you would use for a woman. Now, on the other hand, we also are going to look at labels and identities. Basically, labels are things that are used to refer to other people, and identities are terms that people pick for themselves. And some of these terms can be used and even offend people if they're not being used as identities or labels, or when that gets confused. So if you're familiar with Gabriel Iglesias, and you can take a look at that clip that's listed on the slide, he will say that he does not like being called a Latino comedian. And he explains that it's not like he doesn't like being called Latino, he doesn't like being limited in that his stuff is only relevant for Latinos, which is what he thinks that label implies. If you take a look at his Aloha special in Hawaii, which is on Netflix, he'll go into that a little bit more and talk about how at first he was called a Latino comedian and was only allowed to not allowed, but was only able really to book shows in the Southwest, and it wasn't until he kind of had a breakthrough in Minneapolis when he had a show there, and his agent let him, do that and took a risk on him when they realized that actually white people like him too. He was very popular among all different audiences. So now we're going to take a look at an example of a label and an identity. So Mexican American is a label. Mexican American is similar to African American, Irish American, just means that someone's American, but it's identifying what their descent is, that they have ancestors from Mexico. However, not all Mexican Americans identify as Chicano or Chicana. Chicano or Chicana is a subset of Mexican American. You can't be it if you're not Mexican American, basically. And what it is it's a term that was used in a derogatory way and was basically reclaimed in the 1960s. So you can kind of compare this to the Black is Beautiful movement from the 60s, and people started, instead of straightening their hair, embracing the afro, stuff like that. Well, Chicano, when people started calling themselves Chicano and being proud of it, they were reclaiming that term. Specifically, they were saying that they were proud of their indigenous heritage, and they were associated with a group that wanted to work together towards the betterment of their community. So, as I mentioned, George Lopez is Chicano, Jessica Alba is not. How do I know that? Well, the best way to know that is to talk to them, to ask someone, do you see yourself as Chicano? Or, if you're interviewing an artist, do you see yourself as a Chicano artist? However, if you don't have a chance to do that, what you want to do is just Google interviews with that person. And Google the term Chicano in their name and identity or identify. And you'll find what I did, that Jessica Alba does not seem to identify as being a Chicana. She seems to be less concerned with being kind of socially active in that sense, I guess, socially active in terms of social justice or community. Whereas George Lopez definitely does identify as Chicano. As you can see, this is the title of one of his comedy specials, Tall, Dark, and Chicano. So at this point, we're going to come back to a basic question that I'm going to have you guys answering in your blog as well, and that is, who is American? I want you guys to think about it for a moment. Who is American? What does America look like? Who's not American? Is George Lopez American? Is Shakira American? Is, whoever else, Jennifer Lopez? And I know that within the context of the U.S., we use that to mean who is from the U.S., but when we step outside of that context into Latin American studies, when we're talking about other countries, learning about other countries in a more global context, I want you to expand that definition to include all of the Americas, both North and South America. Second question, which country has the second highest number of Spanish speakers? So quick, pause the video, Google it, see what you find. And you're going to find diverse things, but if the source that you find is using the latest census data, that's census from 2010, you're going to find that it is, in fact, the U.S. The U.S. now has the second highest number of Spanish speakers, second highest only to Mexico, which has the highest number of Spanish speakers in the world. So we're going to see that some of these definitions that we're used to of what's America, what's not, are going to be different based on the context that they're coming out of, and are going to be a little bit more flexible than maybe we realize that they were, or we like to think of them as. So, time for the pop quiz. Number 1. Oh, by the way, stop your computer, write down your answers, and then start again and you get to check them. Number 1. Which of these terms is more of an identity than a label? The answer is Chicano. Chicano is an identity. The other terms can be used as labels, whether or not the person actually identifies with them. Number 2. Which of the following terms would not apply to Shakira, keeping in mind that she's from Colombia? The term here that does not apply to Shakira is Latina. Latina is for people who are born in the United States and have parents from another part of the world, or from Latin America more specifically. Shakira is Latin American, she's Hispanic, she's from a country that was colonized by the Spanish and speaks Spanish. She's also American in a sense of she's part of South America, one of the continents of the Americas. And finally, true or false, Gabriel Iglesias prefers not to be called Latino comedian because it implies that his work is only relevant to a Latino audience. That's true. He points out that, I think he says in one of his specials, no one introduces Jerry Seinfeld as Jewish comedian Jerry Seinfeld. So why should people introduce him as Latino comedian Gabriel Iglesias? This is one of those things where you don't really realize ahead of time how people could take that sort of a title or label. He can be proud to be called Latino, but prefer not to be called a Latino comedian because that can be seen as kind of limiting.